Cool. So we're going to start by getting to know you guys a little bit more. So the first thing we're going to do are these brief surveys to get a sense of who's in the audience. So I'm going to put the link in the chat. And then they're anonymous, and you can just fill them out, and then we'll share the overall patterns in the group.
I'm not seeing the link in the chat, but maybe I just, aha, yay.
I was having trouble multitasking. I had like 10 things open. So we're really excited you're all here. And thank you for everyone who's And then if you can use the link that I just put in the chat, I'll put it in a few times in case it gets lost in the comments. And this is an anonymous survey with 3 questions that we're using to get a sense of who's here. So if anyone just joined, we're doing an anonymous survey that's in the chat to get a sense of who's present. And these are the responses as they come in. And we're really excited to have you all here. It seems like we have really wonderful representation from all around the world and all kinds of different relationships to neurodiversity.
Presentation, but it's in America at 6 p.m. Canadian time. So,
let's go. Yep. Come on, Joe. Yep.
And if people could mute themselves when they're not talking, that would be good because we have a lot of people on here. So we're not able to send around everyone's contact information because of privacy, unless people want their contact information sent around. So we are going to be sending around the recording and a faculty autism and universal design training. So maybe when I send that out, if people want to have their contact information shared, they could just reply with that. And then we could send out an attendee list with anyone who wants to be contacted. There's in the chat about that.
There will also be opportunities to record your contact information in our breakout papers. So that way, maybe if the chat gets too long and we miss people's contact information, you can also put it in the sheets as well.
Yeah, that's a really good strategy. That way that would be much better than everyone sending me emails actually. So if you want your contact information included, put it in the breakout room Google Docs, which Ellie developed. So it seems like our strongest sense of who we are in this group is coming from abilities, which is interesting. It took us a really long time to decide on what categories to put in here. So apologies if we missed relevant categories or merged categories that shouldn't be merged. So abilities is really strongly represented in terms of self-perception and education and friends and family and employment status. So this is how people see themselves, and then let's see if how they feel like they're seen is different or the same. Oh, interesting. I do this activity in my class and I find differences there as well. So here we can see that in terms of how people feel seen, physical appearance, which was actually something we didn't even initially include, we added it based on feedback from Judy, is that what people think is most important in terms of how other people are seeing them, followed by education. So education in a similar place in both lists, followed by age and employment status and ability. And then in terms of how people feel most oppressed by society, the most oppressed is in terms of gender identity, followed by socioeconomic status and diagnoses. Wonderful, thank you guys for filling this out. So we can see that how people feel about themselves is different from how they feel like others see them, and also different from how they feel like they're most oppressed, although there's overlap. So this was a bit.ly we sent around. We can put it in the chat again. Yeah, and Kaden said, I find how others see me hard to answer as I've only been in my own head. So that's definitely true. We're definitely assuming this is how other people see us. So now that we have a bit of a sense of who all of you are, we're going to introduce ourselves. And this whole workshop will be recorded. So we'll be sending around the recording. And I love that people are discussing in the chat. We're hoping that will be a really vibrant space throughout. So I'm Kristen Gillespie Lynch. I'm an associate professor at the College of Staten Island and the Graduate Center. And I do a lot of participatory autism research and a lot of anti-stigma work.
I'm not sure, I can't see Judy, so I'll go next. I'm TC Waisman, I'm calling from Vancouver, Canada. My research was in autism and higher education, and I'm currently carrying out research with Kristen Gillespie Lynch and 14 other collaborators on autism and universal design training for faculty. Also the co-founder of the Autistic Researchers Committee at INSAR, the International Society for Autism Research.
So we can just go in the order of names. I also don't see Judy yet, so maybe we'll wait for her and go in the order of names.
Sounds good. I'm Ellie. You might see Eliana on my screen. I'm a neurodivergent doctoral student at the CUNY Grad Center. I work in the Arts and Development Lab at Brooklyn College, and also with Kristen Gillespie Lynch at CSI. My interests are mostly in creativity, emotions, and neurodiversity.
My name is Bella Kaufner, and I'm an autistic graduate student at the College of Staten Island. I'm one of the co-leaders for the structured group meetings for the program Project Reach, and I'm currently involved with the Autism and UD faculty trained with Dr. Gillespie Lynch and Dr. T.C. Weisman and other collaborators all over the world.
Is Sergey here?
Yes, I'm here. My name is Sergey. I am an undergraduate student at CSI in my senior year, and I do research with Kristen and Bella.
Hi, I'm Santos. I am a Generation 1.5 immigrant and alum of CUNY Hunter and a participatory research member at Project Reach. I'm co-leader with Bella of the Project Reach Skills Development Meeting. So nice to meet all of you.
So we're not sure if Judy is here. She was feeling a little ill, so hopefully she's just late. Are you here, Judy? So we're gonna jump ahead and then come back to Judy's part in hopes that she comes on later. It doesn't seem like she's on right now. So we'll jump ahead and then come back to her part. So hopefully she's on by then. So we're gonna demonstrate one of the principles of universal design, which is flexibility. So I'm gonna move ahead. I'll do my part first because this is a little unexpected. So we're gonna jump ahead to the third part. And then hopefully Judy's on by the time we're done with that part. So we're going in a slightly unexpected order, but that is totally cool. So the thing that our primary focus here is on making society more accessible, because our society is set up in a way that isn't planning for diversity beforehand for the most part. This idea arose in the universal design in architecture movement and then spread into universal design for teaching. And it's been called a number of different things in the teaching framework. It's been called universal design for learning, universal design for instruction, but the underlying principles are the same. So I'm going to be talking about them all through the same lens. And so you couldn't really see this in the prior slides. So it was an example of something not being accessible, but this is from the Universal Design for Learning framework. Probably most of you have come across this before. And so this framework highlights the importance of providing multiple ways to engage and motivate diverse students, multiple ways for them to access information, and multiple ways for them to express their understanding and skills. And you'll have all these slides, so you'll get all of these links. And so in this video, we're going to see part of a video by Stephen Shore, who probably most of you know as well, an autistic professor who co-developed the autism and universal design faculty training with a bunch of other autistic and non-autistic scholars with TCNI. And you're going to receive the entire training after the workshop. So I'm just going to show part of this in the interest of time here.
Hi, everyone. Just sharing a few thoughts about how educational planning for individuals with learning differences ends up benefiting all students. For example, I'm commonly alerted by the Student Support Office of a pupil needing a copy of my lecture notes from a course I'm teaching, or perhaps an advanced organizer. I don't know why they just don't call it an agenda, to help prepare the student for the course material. After informing the office that I always have the period's agenda and slides available online for all students, I then quickly get a return email saying that nothing further needs to be done. Another example of preparing for all learning styles brings to mind when a student disclosed to me that his ADHD resulted in laboriously slow and mostly illegible handwriting, resulting in poor grades for in-class writing assignments, and this would doom him to fail the latest project of describing components of an electronic music lab and how they work together. He thought for a few moments and then requested that he be allowed to draw a map of the electronic music studio instead of writing it out. This alternative approach to demonstrating mastery made perfect sense to me, as I then realized my goal was to assess for mastery of content rather than how fast or neatly he could write. This seemed to be a much better strategy than suggesting he drop the course and return later after practicing penmanship. In fact, the strategy of mapping rather than writing about the electronic music lab was so intriguing to me that I included this as a permanent option for this assignment. We have so much to learn from our students. We only need to observe and listen.
Yeah, so you can actually select closed captioning. It's activated, you just have to select it at the bottom of Zoom. But this is a workshop with limited resources, so we don't have a sign language interpreter. Read the point in the chat. But you can, we have captioning on, so if you select it on your Zoom, you'll see it if you would like it. And so universal design is planning beforehand so that your teaching materials are accessible to people who are diverse in multiple ways. It aims to reduce barriers that make it harder for diverse people to succeed. And it's different from accommodation, which is legally required for people with a documented disability, in that the aim of universal design is to make learning accessible to everyone. And so this is a video also from our training, which you'll also receive the full video later. So I'm just going to show a clip of this. Patrick is also here. And so Patrick co-founded INSAR's new Autistic Researchers Committee with TC Weissman. And here is talking about whether universal design waters down expectations.
Hello, I'm an autistic student, a graduate student, and teaching assistant. And as a TA, certainly I want to make sure that we have high expectations for students and that we're evaluating them fairly. I'm sure that as instructors, you share these concerns. And I wonder if some of you might be thinking about whether universal design and disability accommodations might actually lower our expectations or make evaluation unfair. And I don't think that they do. First of all, on the question of universal design, this is something that we're doing that should be benefiting everybody. It is universal. So it's not unfair. And then as to the question of expectations, since this is making it easier for everyone to learn, it seems kind of like this is actually raising our expectations, making it so that people can learn more out of the class. So that's good.
And so Patrick will go on to talk about the distinction between universal design and accommodations, which people are sometimes confused by. And in particular, that both of them are aiming to make materials accessible to level a playing field. Sorry, it looks like there's not, like the transcription doesn't work on mobiles, and we apologize for that. So universal design requires planning ahead, but that makes things run more smoothly because you've planned ahead and you can adapt. And it's important to point out that it's not just you plan ahead and then you keep things as they are and don't change. Universal design is very much an iterative process where you're reflecting and learning. And so these are some strategies, not at all the strategies you can use to make your course more UD aligned. We have a lot more strategies in our training. So preparing early is really important. Stating and showing that you value all forms of diversity and learning from that diversity in your classroom. Using and explaining why you use different ways of teaching and different ways of assessing. Making course material relevant to students' lives. So this is something that students who are autistic in a participatory research group we're working on really highlight as really essential. So providing choices and making sure material is relevant to them. Providing clear guidelines on expectations and feedback, and setting up lots of creative ways so that people can get to know you and share who they are and how you learn. And so people have really pointed out that the current moment is,
Who are you?
Sorry, I think someone's not muted. I'll mute you, sorry. This is testing my multitasking skills, which is something we're going to talk about in a second. So people have pointed out that universal design is particularly important now because the pandemic has really highlighted all of these inequalities in our educational system, and because people had to transition online and then offline again. And so people have been reaching out to universal design specialists more than ever before, as this article talks about, in hopes that we can redesign education, that we can use this rupture as an opportunity to make things better, than they were before the pandemic. And this is a wonderful idea and it sounds really great, but the reality, as probably a lot of you have thought about, is that universal design is a really vague concept. So it was quickly adopted by policymakers, including the Higher Education Opportunity Act, as a best practice. But what it is and how it's defined is used very inconsistently across studies. It's often talked about as if it's a static thing or a specific technology instead of an iterative process. And maybe most importantly, there's not very much research supporting the central premise of universal design, that planning for one type of diversity is beneficial for other types of diversity. So there's a real need for research to support some of the key things that universal design is putting forward. And you've probably encountered a number of universal design trainings that don't model the techniques that they're supposed to be demonstrating, so that they are super boring. So there's an issue with support and training about universal design as well. And even key leaders in the field of universal design, like Cheryl Burgstaller, have started to highlight some of these critiques. So this is an article that just came out in 2020, talking about some of the concerns about universal design, in that possibly you could water things down by trying to prepare for everyone beforehand, and also the issues with assessment and the research base for universal design. So they're really calling for us to think really critically about what universal design is and how to measure it and use it better in order to make full use of its potential. And so this is a new measure that arose from a workshop of universal design specialists who were addressing issues with universal design, like the lack of precision and the limited evidence base, in hopes of improving assessment. So they used the CAST guidelines, and then they had people rate how much the different instructors they were observing were aligning themselves with those guidelines. And a key thing to look at here is that it's considered incomplete evidence of UDL if learners experience or use a single strategy or tool. So it's believed, in terms of this new assessment that just came out and is very promising, that you need to have multiple tools that learners are using in order to be really practicing universal design. But this raises a question about whether more options are always better. So the universal design framework gives us all of these guidelines and options that we should provide, but it, in some senses, sets up conflicts with other approaches to educational psychology, like Meyer's principles of effective multimedia instruction. So one of Meyer's principles is that by adding text to a pre-existing video with audio, you may make it more distracting and harder to learn from for many people. Obviously not for people who need the text in order to understand what's going on. So Meyer's principles often highlight that providing more information can sometimes be counterproductive and work against your aims. His work was conducted in very careful experiments, examining each principle, but without students who had identified disability. So some of these gaps between these different educational approaches may arise because of different populations that people were thinking of as they developed them. But universal design was developed with this aim of reaching everyone. And so this raises some issues about the choices we provide and how we know which choices are beneficial and which ones might be counterproductive in certain instances. And so now we're going to do a breakout group. We're going in a somewhat odd order because Judy wasn't here at the beginning. And so you're going to have Google Docs, and we're going to put the link in the chat. Ellie just put in the chat. So Ellie developed this wonderful system of Google Docs. You're going to be assigned to a breakout room. That is going to be the same breakout room that you're going to be in for each of the breakout groups. And so you want to remember that number, because you're going to use that number to go into your breakout group's Google Doc that has the same number as your breakout group. And so then you're going to introduce yourself and do the icebreaker at the beginning of the breakout, but then go down in the document to breakout group 3, because this is, we skipped ahead a little bit because Judy wasn't here, and then discuss the questions in that breakout group document. And this is a resource that we're going to use when compiling resources from this workshop to make an overall document that we're all going to author as a recommendation moving forward. And so I'm going to send, go ahead.
Kristen, I just wanted to point out there was a question in the chat from Usma Wasim. She asked, or they asked, does the paradox of choice play a role here in relation to making decision-making processes more problematic?
I think it probably does. I don't know that term though, the paradox of choice. Do you want to explain it? It sounds like it definitely does.
Yeah, it's just something that I came up with, I sort of came across a while back. It's a term that has been discussed a lot in the field of economics and behavioral, sort of behavioral economics, and by Barry Schwartz, I think it was. And it's basically just explaining that where it may be a good thing to offer choice and options in terms of accommodating and building that level playing field. So just creating more accessible options, making, you know, the whatever the context is, more equitable to lots of people. Then there's also the flip side of it, obviously, you know, causing that sort of decision paralysis. So I just wondered whether that also plays a part here, considering that, well, are these really options and choices you're offering a single person? Because it may not be. So that's just where I was getting at, really, if that helps make sense.
Yeah, I love that. That sounds directly applicable. And Patrick, for like when you have a menu and there are several good things and you don't know which one to get. But the other hand, for those of us with sensory sensitivities, there might be just one option, and cutting menu options could hurt us. Yeah, it's a very tricky issue. Cool, so I'm going to open the breakout group. So just remember what number you're in. And Allison said demand avoidant people struggle here too. So I haven't opened them yet. I'm going to open them now. And so just remember what number you're in and go to the Google Doc for your number. And then the confusing thing here is you're going to go down to the third set of questions in the Google Doc because we skipped ahead. So Judy is now here, but we're going to go in reverse order. So TC is going to be next. But first, we wanted to hear from you about ideas that you came across in the breakout group. You could either share in the chat or by speaking.
I wanted to mention something first, is that because the breakout rooms ended up being larger than we expected, the introductions took up more time, so we didn't get to have that much of a discussion going. So everybody, you still have access to the Google Docs, so please feel free to add your perspectives to it, especially if you didn't get to have your perspectives heard.
Oh, I see what happened. I made the groups much bigger than expected. So,
How much bigger?
Yeah. So I think what I'm going to do in the next set of breakout groups is I'm going to reassign people. So you have this breakout groups. I was trying to put you in groups of 4, but I made 4 breakouts. So you have massive groups. So you'll explore breakout group size to see what works better. and probably smaller groups will work better. So you'll just join a different Google Doc in the next set of breakout groups. But based on what people did get a chance to discuss, I see that people have been writing some really interesting things in the Google Doc. So you could write your answers to what does universal design, yeah, it worked out as a networking opportunity for the first one. So you could either share verbally or write in the chat, what does universal design mean to you? What are some teaching strategies that you think engage all students? What are some teaching strategies that you think help some students while making learning harder for others? Which I think is a really interesting question. And what are some barriers you or others have experienced in trying to use UD-aligned teaching strategies? And then how can we work together to overcome these strategies? So if anyone wants to share verbally or in the chat, we'd love to discuss.
So I'm the reporter for group 1. And somebody said that they love the idea that universal design is iterative and that there's no universal design for everyone. And they've found that there's rarely universal design that makes their dyslexic life any easier or fits their particular constellation of abilities. It's crucial to provide multiple ways in and out of any topic or assignment. And I agree with that. Like anything, it can be implemented ineffectively, but that doesn't mean the principles are flawed.
Yeah, I love those insights. So it sounds like you guys were able to come up with very strong insights despite all the introductions.
Definitely for the first question.
And you can keep working on the other questions if you have extra time with the other breakout group. So does one of the other giant breakout groups want to share what you came up with?
I'll just say for group 4, we didn't get through introductions. So I would like to share that it was lovely to meet everyone.
So the reason it's confusing is because I was a little distracted because we were changing our order around. So I made 4 massive breakout groups instead of great breakout groups that had 4 people in them. We were actually discussing in our participatory meeting today how breakout group size might influence learning. So we've learned from this that very large breakout groups do not help learning. And so Damon wrote in the chat, being autistic means that often people believe I need visual instruction when actually I learn better by hearing content.
Thing for this, don't I? I haven't got the right.
I will sneak peek, but that means I can't hear as well. My senses can get in the way of one another. I understand many find visual learning more helpful than I do. Yeah, I think that's a really key misconception about the spectrum is that everyone wants visual learning.
Oh, yeah, I haven't got the right.
Kelly, thank you for bringing that up. That closed captioning unfortunately doesn't work in the breakout session. Sorry about that.
We didn't get to discuss it since we were introducing, but for what barriers have you experienced for trying to use UD-aligned teaching strategies? Some that I've encountered is buy-in from other faculty or other TAs, and then like my own issues with time management in terms of like, you know, having materials ready early for people. So sort of trying to navigate wanting to use universal design, but then also having my own difficulties on the instructor side of that.
Yeah, that's something I struggle with as well, the time management part of universal design.
One thing that, you know, I mentioned building on the point earlier about the paralysis of choice is that in one of my undergrad classes, you know, the instructor offered a ton of choice, which, you know, ought to have been super wonderful, right? Except that now all of the students were panicking because they were wondering, like, should I do the assignment using option A or option B or option C? And it became really anxiety provoking. So that's a challenge, but somebody else responded to that by saying that, you know, we can still be flexible there. It's just that if somebody, you know, is finding the choice paralyzing, then we can, you know, assign something for them to do, reduce the number of options. So you can even be flexible about the amount of flexibility.
That is very wise. So starting with many options and then narrowing if it's overwhelming and anxiety producing.
I'd probably say that for me, it's less about universal design and more about universal accommodation and universal support. Because, for example, one of the things in our business is we often talk about some of the accommodations that people make. For me, being autistic, are actually really useful for reflective thinkers as well, you know, like having information up front and ensuring that if trainers come in, they give the course content up front so reflective thinkers can participate and contribute at the same level as instant thinkers. So, you know, it's almost universal accommodation rather than universal design.
By universal accommodation, do you mean like responding to, like shifting in response to feedback?
Yeah, so design seems more fixed, something that you kind of agree up front. Whereas accommodations are more about the policies and processes you put in place for a specific instance. And the two kind of work together, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, and I think that fits with why people end up thinking that universal design is the static thing sometimes, instead of something they need to keep reflecting on. It might even be part of the terminology.
Yeah, design does tend to be something that you do and then it's finished.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And there's a point in the chat about students feeling more comfortable speaking in chat than they would ever in face-to-face. I'd like to have both that in my future as a teacher. That's something that my students who are teachers have talked about as well, is students who were very shy actually coming back when school is in person, less shy, because they've learned to express themselves in a more comfortable format.
One of the things from not an educational setting, but in a lot of the talks that I do is when people are asking for accommodations, we give people the option of doing things anonymously. And also questions anonymously, because sometimes, particularly with how sensitive language is in for some people, you know, they don't want to ask the question because they're afraid they'll ask it in the wrong way, and then people will judge them, particularly when they're new to a group. So actually, we found that allowing anonymous questions in sessions like this are really, really useful, because then people ask more difficult questions or questions they might not otherwise ask.
And Nicola, that's actually a really good point about intersectionality. And you're talking about the fact that we're not accommodating, but actually allowing space for different cultures, different kinds of use of language. And it also means that people can be curious and ask questions that may seem simplistic, but are extremely helpful for the rest of us to think in a different way. Well done.
If I could inject, I don't know the speaker that was just talking regarding policy as it interfaces with universal design and universal support, but I certainly love the reframing of that, especially when we look in the Canadian public educational system. As a parent and an advocate, it's certainly the language around universal design kind of diminishes those conversations around policies and procedures and what is protecting the child's right for education and where those supports come in. And so the conversation of universal support is something definitely, I think I'm going to grab that language and start pulling it forward, because we need to make sure when we're looking at how support comes in through the educational system and across Canada, and it's seated in those ministerial acts, that policy and procedure needs to be backing it up in language. And if we eliminate some of that, especially in BC, when we see our new special education policy manual coming out shortly, and there's been a large number of pieces that have been redacted and we don't know yet. It's been 2 years that it's been gone, and it's in the works, we're told, coming soon. And I know universal design is influencing that conversation. I'm not confident that our children's voices are being supported adequately as this new procedure manual is going to come forward. So I think it's definitely an important conversation we pull forward with.
I love that you're saying that, Suzanne, because I've literally just written an article on representation in moving forward, say, for example, the autism framing, because so many charities are actually boards of parents who then change the language to often medical language when they're framing design and any other thing, which is about the lack of ability. So actually, one of the things that we've just been speaking about is, instead of labels that talk about high functioning or low functioning or whatever the label might be, profoundly or whatever, it's about support needs, and support needs can be a lot more spiky on a day-to-day basis. So you can have high support and low support on the same person on different days, and that's a more useful conversation.
So thank you all. This has been a wonderful dialogue, even though you were in those massive groups. You're clearly all universal design oriented, rapid responders. And
I just had something that's wait. I'm not sure if it can be changed, but I find attitude. So I guess, could it be possible that the medical model has their lens already and philosophy, but is it possible to change attitude as you're changing context, or does attitude need to be matched for the context, or just a universal attitude of engaging with the specific neurodiversity? Because I found that in in certain contexts, especially complex, diverse experiences and challenges, and also in certain aspects, I won't say the name of the service, but I found out that at least it seems in the ER where there's not enough time that they dislike individuals with neurodevelopmental disabilities. There's kind of a qualitative statement, so don't take it as fact, and check it out in your own region. But so yeah, I don't know if attitude could be, if that could be modified, but it just came to my fore because I'm like, well, yeah, universal is about access, it's about context, it's about modality of learning and all learning strategies. But I mean, that's kind of the basic foundation, although forgive me if it's not basic to you, but forgive me for saying that. But so, you know, but could you have such a thing as universal adaptive attitude? You know, I don't know. Thanks.
I think maybe a term that has been floating around lately is anti-ableist pedagogy. You know, where a lot of what you're talking about is basically calling people out on their internalized ableism, right? So if someone is like not willing to be universally designed, then they need to like interrogate what's going on there. You know, like you know, why aren't you being universally designed? And what does this have to do with like the stigma you have about like, you know, disabled people and neurodivergent people, neurodiverse people? You know, I think that's the first step in like that attitude piece, you know, but also, you know, yeah, so basically the concept of anti-ableism and anti-ableist pedagogy. And I think UDL is a really nice response to that, you know, it's seeking to do that.
And this is a perfect segue to TC. So we're going to be reflecting on these themes throughout, but we're going to transition into TC's presentation now. This is a really perfect segue.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's actually excellent for segueing in. And can I share my slides, or is that okay? Let me try this. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just play it from the current slide. So I'm going to be speaking about intersectionality, and this is the perfect transition because this is really about attitudes, about how universal design may or may not work. And so I'm not going to come up with a solution or an answer, but we're going to have a discussion. And I'm going to start with the end in mind. I'm going to give you 2 points about intersectionality that are the takeaway points of my tiny little discussion here. And this is just a whistle-stop tour. It's a very reductionist perspective on intersectionality. So again, this is just to encourage you to have a conversation, continue the conversation that has already been started. So the first point here is this quote by Audre Lorde: "There's no such thing as a single issue." Oh, that disappeared. There's no such thing. Oh, there we go. Now it's going. "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." We're not siloed people, you and I. We have many, many issues. We have many wonderful things that happen in our lives. There's no such thing as taking one single issue and defining ourselves by that or defining somebody else, because we are multiply issued in our lives, especially in healthcare. I'm just using that as an example because I'm autistic as well. And also the other thing is that I want you to know that understanding intersectionality is a key to inclusion. We have all of these conversations going on about inclusion and equity and diversity. One of the main things that we have to talk about, again, which the gentleman brought up so wisely, is about the conversation about our attitudes towards inclusion. And that if we start to understand intersectionality, we'll start to understand pathways that we can make through. Sorry, my computer's not wanting to work. So I'm going to give you 3 definitions of intersectionality. You can mix and match and choose your own, but these 3 I think are important to just at least bounce around. One is that intersectionality is about identities, and identities Kimberly Crenshaw speaks about are the relationship of people and our histories, of how we see ourselves and of how we see others see us. And of course, as we know, how we see ourselves changes. So our identities and what goes to the top of what we think is more valuable or not as valuable changes through time, and sometimes changes very quickly. Here's another definition. I'm not sure why this is not working. This is the Merriam-Webster's dictionary's definition. They talk about the complex, intersectionality is the complex and cumulative ways in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination combine, overlap, and intersect in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. So now we're moving away from an identity framework and talking about the cumulative ways and the effects of multiple forms of discrimination and the way that they overlap and intersect in the experiences of marginalized groups. And last is Kimberly Crenshaw's theory. And Kimberly Crenshaw, for those of you who haven't heard of her, is she's sort of one of the people, or she came up with the intersectionality theory. And often she describes it not as a theory, but as a prism through which you see a problem. So the many ways that you can see a problem. And so in her theory of intersectionality, her prism, she says that this is how inequalities persist as overlapping and mutually constitutive systems rather than isolated and distinct structures. So now we're talking about systems of power, and these systems are constitutive, which means that they build on each other and nurture each other in order for them to continue. They're not isolated and they're not distinct. So we're looking at intersectionality today under these three frames: our identities, how we see ourselves and each other, how the effects of intersectionality, and how these systems continue and grow. And we're going to look at one system in particular. Well, we're going to look at two, but I'm going to start with the family system when we're talking about systems of power. And family systems are really something that I think we can really look at and understand quite simply. In a family system of power, as an individual, your function isn't determined just by your individuality. It's also determined by your place within the system. It's determined by the push and pull, the competing demands, the loyalties you have within the family relationships, the coalitions you form with siblings or parents or outsiders and aunties and uncles, the boundaries, the hierarchical issues. And so because this system is at play, you as an individual, even though you have your individuality, you are part of this system, and your actions and reactions to the system help to define who you are. And so although there are many family systems theories, the underlying foundation of the family systems theory is that, now let's hope this works, where there is a patient, there is a troubled family system. So there's no sort of silo. If there's a patient that they're working with in family systems theory, then there's a broken family system. You can't separate the person from the system. So I want to apply that to education because that's what we're talking about right now. So we're looking at the education system and sort of the power differential within the education system. So who are the kinds of people that come to us in higher education? Well, everybody, anyone who wants an opportunity, anyone who believes that an education will give them something more than they have. So we have this rich tapestry of people from different cultures and ethnicities, socioeconomic backgrounds and abilities and gender identities. And again, these are just a very few identities. This is a very reductionist perspective, but we have a really rich framework of people who are coming to us, who are coming for an education, and they're wanting to do something that will enrich their lives. And they come not in silos. I'm not showing up as a Black person or as a woman or as autistic. I'm showing up as all of that and more. And sometimes within the education system, there are barriers, known and unknown barriers, individually held barriers by teachers, by administrators, by policymakers, decision makers, and also system-wide barriers. And some of those barriers that people encounter include classism, ableism, racism, disabling policies and structures, and sexism. And because we're not experiencing these things in silos, we're experiencing some of these things in multiple layers, it's very difficult for us to be able to say, listen, I'm really needing this accommodation for myself as an autistic person. You're giving me an accommodation and not really allowing me to not really understanding my cultural needs, my, the things that the other parts of me, I have to leave those at home in order to get this certain kind of accommodation. So often, and I'm sure it's not just me, I don't end up taking the accommodations that I'm offered because it just doesn't fit my needs. So what happens when, and we're moving away from just sort of the usual reasons why people drop out of school, stressors in life and such. What happens when people who are going through multiple barriers and hitting these barriers over and over and over again, what happens to them? They end up dropping out a lot of times. And who are the kinds of people who we're losing, who are falling through the gap? People who are minoritized, we're seeing a lot of them dropping out over and over again, people who are poor. And when I say disabled, I don't necessarily mean that their disability, my disability, I mean that the structure itself is disabling to some of us and those who are feeling oppressed. And this is really hard to sort of quantify, but I'm going to try and quantify it with a story in a minute. But when we're looking at this perspective through the lens of family systems and looking at it in education, we find that, and can I go back? Where there are barriers, there's a troubled education system. So in the family system, where there's a patient, there's a troubled family system. Where there are barriers, these are really big clues that there's a troubled family system, education system. So I'm just going to tell you a story about, and this is just one person's story about the multiple barriers that exist, the attitudes that exist, and those attitudes are barriers as well. And this is, this is not atypical at all. In fact, I think that most people who are listening to my voice can relate in some way, either through their own stories or through their parents' stories, and so on. So this is my story. This is my family in 1976 when we first moved to Canada, and that's me in the orange and yellow dress, full of hope. We moved to Canada because my dad is Southeast Asian, and Indigenous Pacifica. My mom is Indigenous Pacifica going back 50,000 years. Because it was a mixed marriage, my dad experienced some prejudice and wanted us to have a better life. We came to Canada. I didn't know I was autistic until I was, in my late 40s. So I sort of didn't know my quirkiness, wasn't a problem in elementary school. Got to high school, it became a really big problem. I had issues with the sound of sneakers in the hallway, the lockers slamming, the fluorescent lights. I started to shut down a lot. And at that time, when I went to high school, it was the early 80s. There was a lot of prejudice, and it was really actually quite open. So teachers had no trouble making fun of me, using the N-word, making fun of my curly hair, asking me if I could rap for the class, over and over and over and over again. I survived high school, and that was fine, and I went to college. It took me 9 years to do a 2-year diploma program because what's worse than blatant racism is racism that's invisible to when you're privileged enough to see it. My dad speaks Hindi, and my last name is an Indian last name, but most people see me as Black. That's how they perceive me. They certainly don't see the Asian in me. The first day of class in one of my colleges, in the first semester, we were all sitting in class. Class had started, and a gentleman with a turban walked in and asked if this was the right class. It was not the right class, and he left. The instructor said, phew, to the rest of us. Thank God he's not going to be in this class. There are times when you understand that you have a choice. Do you stay and get an education, or do you stand up and say something? And there was another memory I have of 3 beautiful Asian women walking past my classroom, speaking very loudly in their language, and my professor slamming the door in their face as they were walking by to let them know that he was annoyed, and then coming in and making fun of the language. And it's a choice that some of us make all the time. Do I get up and say something because he doesn't know I'm part Asian? Do I get up and say something because he doesn't know that my dad speaks Hindi? Or do I get an education? It took me 9 years because there were many times that my heart was broken and I left it on the table and I walked out the door and I quit. I'm 52 now and I just got my doctoral degree in November. It's taken me this long. So when we're talking about the story of intersectionality, we're talking about all of the pieces who we are, all of the histories, all the things that we bring, the stories that we bring. Sorry, this is not an unusual story at all. And the story of intersectionality to me is the story of hope and resilience, whether you're from the Czech Republic or from Turtle Island and you're indigenous here, or from the Philippines or wherever you're from, we have these stories within us. And when we're asked to leave them at the door, how is that possible? So for me, intersectionality can be a key to inclusion, but we have to, as educators, and I don't mean just educators in formal settings. I mean, if you're a mother teaching a child, if you're a child teaching your parent, if you're a brother or sister or an uncle and an auntie, we have to re-examine and adjust the practices that we perform that reduce people and the challenges that they face into mutually exclusive groups. Intersectionality can provide a pathway to inclusion, but only if we're willing to learn from and with our diverse and neurodiverse population. Is UD enough? If UD is built on a foundation of increased understanding of intersectionality, then yes, we can disrupt a broken system. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much, TC. That was so powerful.
TC, you're getting a lot of love in the chat.
Oh, sorry, I can't see the chat anymore. I'm out of it. I don't know how to get
Great
back.
job, TC.
Thanks. How do I get back in?
So we're gonna now send everyone to breakout rooms that are the right size instead of the massive ones. So you'll have 4 people in your breakout room. You'll have around 8 minutes to talk about the questions about intersectionality. Ellie cleaned up the document, so she saved what you wrote previously, so you'll have fresh documents for your new breakout numbers. So I'm going to make much more reasonable size of breakout group.
Take a couple of hours more. So we were enjoying it so much.
Oh, and I'm back.
Hi, Gord. Hi, everyone. How you going?
Hello.
Welcome back.
I can start. I was in room 6 about intersectionality and what it meant to us. So we were talking about how intersectionality is not just sort of marginalized identities for the first question, but that can be a diverse number of quantifiers, such as being a mom, a wife, a dad, a husband, a sister, and that identities can also be fluid and switching. We talked about code switching, for example, as being something that you might have to do depending on the contexts, and when that also talked about specific incidents, which I'm not going to share just because I don't know if I have permission, but we talked about specific incidents wherein people felt like they were either the target of exclusion or they witnessed exclusion. So it went well.
Wonderful, thank you, Jen.
And Jen, could you explain for people who don't know what code switching is? Could you just explain a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So an example, I think it would be easier to just go with an example is, for instance, if you have an African-American person, right, and they have to interact in a predominant environment, they're going to behave differently from when they're maybe with their other African-American family members, with people who are, more sort of in culture, in the same sort of environment that they were raised and sort of taught in and things like that. So code switching is sort of going between, different sets of rules for like social interactions and behaviors that's relevant to a lot of identities.
Lisa, I see your hand is raised.
I can't unmute. Oh, there. Sorry. I just wanted to add to the code switching comment so just shifting how you talk depending on the context is just, it's called style shifts, and we all do it. We all talk to our partners different than we talk to our boss, than we talk to somebody at the grocery store or a clerk at another store. So we all do it. We all do style shifts, and code switching takes it to a different level where it could be somebody who's multilingual and who just shifts into different languages in one sentence. So code switching is pretty vast, but when we look at it within this idea of power systems and idea of intersectionality, we look at how some groups need to code switch a lot more in order to pass, in order to mask, in order to not be further marginalized. And so, for example, with African Americans in the US and a predominantly white dominated society, talking a certain way, walking, dressing, all of the codes that you use to engage and communicate need to kind of pass as appropriate and proper to the larger white world. So we all code switch and do style shifts, but when we look at it from a power system perspective, we see how oppressive it is for some groups more than others. So I just wanted to add that.
Kristen, there are a lot of raised hands. I don't know if we have time for all of them, but in order, maybe we could go for another one.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd call in people.
Sweet. Okay. Callaway. I saw Callaway next.
So our group 22, we were very impressed with Dr. Wiseman's story, and we kind of springboarded off of that. And one of the group members talked about how intersectionality, for what it means to them, was very much a lived experience, how it was similar to their life. And that led into answering the other questions, and how exclusion is something that educators have a lot of control over, because educators are in charge of determining who's included in the class and who's included in the instruction. We also talked about the importance of being aware of culturally responsive teaching, and how part of intersectionality is about being aware of each student and each individual as an individual instead of as a single identity. And that's especially important considering that, like, if schools have a difficult time adjusting or accommodating for a particular single identity, then they can't do the accommodations necessary for an intersection of multiple identities. Versus if educators can approach things from an intersectionality aspect and see what universal design is necessary to allow every individual access to the classroom, it allows for a greater options of learning.
Thanks, Callaway. I saw Rita next. We have one more time, or time for one more. So for the other three hands raised, if you wouldn't mind writing your stuff in the chat, that'd be helpful.
Thank you, Eliana. So we talked about what intersectionality meant to us, and we talked about the different pieces of our identity and how, whether it's like race, gender, sexual identity, disability, or no disability, and how some aspects of our identity can act as like privilege versus others are more seen as oppression. And I talked a little bit more about masking and how sometimes you might come from a minority group or you might be diverse, but it might be just easier to mask in certain experiences. And I talked about my own experience. I'm not from the US, but I don't have a very heavy accent. I'm from Lebanon. And so when I tell people that, they're like, oh, you don't really look Lebanese and you don't sound Lebanese. So sometimes it's just easier to mask. Even sometimes when I'm in an airport and there are a lot of Lebanese people around, I just like mask because I may not look Lebanese, right? Although there isn't like that stereotype. So we talked about that and we had a very interesting discussion, Elizabeth and I, and how it might be easy to leverage privilege, although there might be some long-term stressors associated with masking.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for your insights. Now we're going to transition to Judy, who is here now. And so Judy is going to start her presentation now. We're extremely excited to have her here. It's a very different time in Australia than it is here.
Yes, as we discovered. Okay, am I ready to go?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so first I'm going to try and share my screen and hope this works. And here we are. Share. And off we go from beginning. Right. So just get rid of a picture of myself, which is disconcerting. Okay, so the first point that I really wanted to make, neurodiversity, it's a social movement. That is what I intended it to be, the name of. It's the name of a social movement. And you can see some of the words there for change, inclusion, acceptance, understanding, recognition, respect. It's a human right to be respected. It's also, for me, about naming rights, the right to name yourself as opposed to having a name imposed upon you. And I guess that applies to all intersectionalities as well. I'm really glad TC went first because intersectionality and neurodiversity is so closely related. So to move on to the origins of the idea, that's a picture of me and my mother and daughter. And my work was based on my experiences of outsiderhood in the middle of 3 generations of women, which I call somewhere on the autistic spectrum. And because of that, my subject positions aren't easily unified. My experiences as the daughter of a woman with Asperger's or autism, the mother of a daughter and a person facing discrimination, and myself, while in some ways we have very different abilities and disabilities. My work was based on my membership of online autistic spectrum e-groups back in the 90s, and I was studying sociology and disability studies at the time, and the work was done within the social constructionist model of disability at University of Technology, Sydney in 1998. Social constructionist, and I guess most of you would know what it is, but I'll just quickly say the difference between the medical model and the social model of disability. The medical model says disability is within the individual. The social model says it may be partly in the individual, but it's also a result of a lack of accommodation and barriers and our cultural beliefs and practices. So I just quickly added this slide in after hearing TC, and as you can see, I've actually blurred out all the there's some background noise. I'm not sure what's going on. I blurred out some of all the actual things because, you know, when I think about all the intersectionalities that I've got and also the society I live in, I have to blur out and mask just about all of them. And there are so many. And sometimes it feels completely overwhelming. Just to say something about what's involved there, I'm very poor, and that's a result of I'm at the bottom socioeconomic percentile in my country, and that's directly a result of discrimination against autistic people and the depression that I suffered as a result of all the other things that were going on in my life. I live in public housing, but I lucked out, and I'm in one of the most wealthiest suburbs of Sydney. And my friends are all white Anglo middle class Australians, and I'm glad none of them are listening, but basically I feel that I really love them and they're wonderful people, but this is all the stuff that I have to blot out, and I know that it makes people uncomfortable if I talk about it. Moving on. So what you probably want to know is, what is neurodiversity? I think everybody knows, has heard of it now and knows what it's about. But I'll just go through it anyway, because when I first came up with the idea, I had a real aha moment and thought, what a perfect name for a movement, and an addition to the categories of intersectionality. And I didn't even bother to define it. And it's only lately, when in the last couple of years, when I've had to, that I realize it's not as simple as it looks. However, let's jump in. Well, it represents a new way of framing the DSM-4's psychiatric disorders. It was based on the pioneering work of the autistic self-advocacy movement, and it moved us from the deficit model, the medical model, to a strengths and challenges model. And this was also based on the work that I did in the disability rights movement that pioneered this. But in those days, there were only 3 categories of disability: physical, intellectual, and mental illness, which was the grab bag of everything else, which we all fell into, and actually none of those suited us. In my thesis, I said that we needed a new paradigm with new languages, and that neurodiversity would augment the insights of the existing disability rights movement. The word actually originated because from a combination of neuroscience and the environmental movement. It was an era when hard neuroscience was beginning to eclipse the sort of soft science of psychotherapeutics, if it was a science at all. To some extent it was. It was basically psychotherapy was becoming a bit of a joke. And, people had been going to therapists for decades and simply not changed. And also for autistic people, I know for myself, I spent decades going to therapists trying to work out things like, how come I've got such bad eye control? What did my parents do to me? And there was no answer forthcoming. So neuroscience was starting to give us answers. And similarly, the growing influence of the environmental movement, which coined biodiversity in 1980s in the same way as I did, as more of a political thing, not a scientific thing, as an argument for the conservation of environments. So, and by suggesting that the most successful environments were the most diverse environments. And I could see that, though I was in the autistic movement, autistic self-advocacy movement, we started talking a lot about autistics and cousins, people with ADHD, the dyspraxia, lexia, the dys sisters, I call them, praxia, lexia, calculia, and they were starting to join in. So we needed a name for an umbrella movement for all of us that had common issues, and it needed a catchy, authoritative name. Aha, neurodiversity. Now, what do I do now? Next, I've forgotten how to move on. Oh, goodness. Oh, here we go. So that's just quickly, my thesis was called A Personal Exploration of a New Social Movement Based on Neurological Diversity. And this is the only time I mention neurodiversity, actually. The significance lies in its call for an anticipation of a politics of neurodiversity. The neurologically different represent a new addition to the familiar categories of class, gender, race, etc. Oh, blank page. So what I wanted to say about neurodiversity is that I see it as a tool. It's a political concept, a category to add to intersectionality, and a tool for social analysis. And it's not a diagnosis. It's not a psychomedical concept. It's a self-evident truism that everybody on the planet is different, has a different kind of mind. It's absolutely should not be used as a synonym for neurological disorder, for the simple reason that that is immediately turns it into a tool to separate us from them. And that image there is supposed to be of a globe of faces that are cut in half by a medical scalpel into normal and neurodiverse, or us and them. That was not the intention, which is not to say that I don't believe that there's any such thing as disability, but disability varies from culture to culture, and the accommodations that are made for it. There are probably some things that are so profound that they would be disabilities in any culture, however they define disability. But I don't want to go too much into that, except to say that my work was actually based on Asperger's syndrome, or what's known as high functioning autism. I specifically said I was not talking about what was called classical autism because I have no experience of it. So make of that what you will. So moving on to the achievements of the movement. Well, I think we're already in the process of changing cultural perceptions of what it means to be human, and changing our simplistic dichotomies about human minds. I was so amused about 10 years ago when people came up with multiple intelligence, 4 of them. I just thought, how absurd. There's just almost an infinite excuse me, I'm just recovering from a terrible cold and I just got tested COVID negative, so sorry, give me a moment. We're already changing public and private sector diversity policies. So I particularly noticed it in the UK. I know that in America, of course, there's all the different states would have different policies, so I don't really know what's going on there. You would know that better than me. We've already made it unacceptable to look at people by their deficits only, or to mock, bully and humiliate people for their difference. And one of the first things the seminal influence for me when I was starting my thesis was I'd just watched the film Grease, and there was a section in which, you know, the heroes or the eventual heroes encounter Eugene the nerd on the stairs and start pushing him around and mocking him. And I thought, how is that even considered acceptable and funny? And that is the kind of thing that that goes on and still goes on that I want to change. We now have a burgeoning neurodiversity industry. And of course, we have neurodiversity pride, and people are populating the ideas with myriads and millions and countless narratives of their life story. So I was touted as that I was going to say something about commodification, of neurodiversity, which is not that relevant here. But since it's there, I'm going to say something. And commodification is a process of turning something or someone into a commodity that can be bought and sold. I mean, there's a positive to it. It's the driving force of entrepreneurship within our liberal democracies that has unleashed more freedom to differ, and thus more creativity and fulfillment than, I wouldn't say in any other system. I should change that. It's more in our culture, in which I would call Western Christian civilization. And that is basically what I mean by white. Risks. Well, losing sight of the noble aims in the pursuit of profit. Reboxing people, like they talk about neurodiversity takes us out. I've forgotten the exact phrase. Out of the box thinking. That's right. Well, maybe and maybe not. Let's not start a whole set of new stereotypes. it's not just about autistic coders. Now, this is very concerning to me because so many companies are starting up neurodiversity inclusion, neurodiversity training and coaching and all the rest of it, and employment agencies. And what I'm finding is that while they're talking about neurodiversity, when you look at the brochures of who they're placing, it's all computer programmers, coders, and mostly male. And that is just not good enough. We've got to start looking at finding jobs for women, and also, obviously, if you look at the brochures, almost overwhelmingly white or sometimes Asian, because Asians are supposed to be geeks as well. So there's another level of stereotyping there. It's not good enough. We've got to find roles for everybody. And women, for instance, women are good at writing, editing, copywriting, librarianship, all sorts of things. And by the way, I don't mean to say that that women aren't good at programming. In fact, I was a programmer for most of my life, my working career. So, yes, there's a lot of work to be done there. So what can educators do? Well, I'm not going to give you a whole list of motherhood statements here that you all know already. Obviously, respect the uniqueness of each human mind. Remember, theory of mind. It was said that autistic people didn't have a theory of mind. Actually, none of us have very good theories of other kinds of minds until we're educated into it. Don't ask me so much, but turn to respected trainers. And don't expect rainbows and sunshine. And I'm just going to finish with this quote that I've adapted from the Talmud. You don't have to finish the task, but we're all responsible for co-creating a better world. Thus, you are not free to desist from giving it your best shot. And finally, I'm going to say something about is UDI enough? In my personal experience, all intersectional discrimination flows downhill and pools in a poverty. I was just thought cesspit, and maybe it does. UDI is not enough without what people are starting to fight for, a universal basic income in countries that are perfectly wealthy enough to do so, except for punitive attitudes and greed. UBS, universal basic services, adequate public holidays, health, education, and finally, adequate housing. You cannot study if all your basic hierarchy of needs are not met. And so I just want to add that intersectionality may divide us, but we must all join together in what is a political fight for the fair distribution of resources so that all can flourish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. So I think because we only have a few minutes left, we're not going to do the last breakout. Instead, we're going to reflect here and then do a synthesis together. So if people want to share your thoughts in the chat or by speaking.
Oh, sorry, did I talk for too long? I forgot to put a timer on.
No, it was great. You didn't talk for too long at all. It's all wonderful.
The most important thing is that everyone has a chance to say what they want to say. That's the most important part.
So I'm going to put up synthesis questions. And so what we're doing with these is we're going to develop a working document based on all of the ideas you guys raised, both in your Google Docs and in the chat and in the discussion. And that will be a document of recommendations going forward that people can continue to revise. And so we wanted people to reflect on this question of what are key challenges educators face in effectively teaching their diverse students, and what are key strategies to address these challenges. So if you can share your ideas about these in the chat, we have a few synthesis questions.
And we're doing this now, but we haven't heard about universal design yet, or is that afterwards?
We jumped ahead, so we heard about that first.
Okay, sorry.
And we discussed questions related to this when we were talking about universal design. So I'm going to put all 5 of the questions that we are going to discuss now in the chat in case people want to jump ahead. So you can pick which question you think is most interesting to write about. So it looks a little overwhelming in the chat, sorry.
And people can feel free to speak up as well and answer the questions.
Hi, somebody said in the chat, who's it? Was it Pat? Pam said collaborative goal making and goal sharing. And I think like raising awareness with colleagues so that people who are engaging in universal design don't seem like outliers, but so that, you know, that the practice, you know, gets established. One, so that the iterative process can include more people, but also to, you know, reduce stigma and people misunderstanding it as, you know, a lowering or whatever of expectations. So, you know, just spreading the word, right?
I just wrote a key challenge to me is creating safe and engaging structures and culture in where I am as post-secondary education.
Exactly.
Your point, I'm seeing safety come up a lot in the chat.
I could add that I feel like having an autistic son who is almost 25 allows me to create a relatively safe space for all of my students to share their own identities and who they are, and also sharing my own struggles with anxiety so they understand, you know, I don't know. So it's more, so I wanted to turn away from challenges and like here that, you know, this is something that we can leverage our own identities to open up to our students and create that safe space, no matter what support or not we get from administration.
I think that's a really important point, and I really love what people are saying in the comments as well. And Bernardo shared an accessibility resource in the chat.
Can I just say actually nothing that without placing responsibility in the lap of the autistic student, absolutely, that isn't my intention. But I suppose I'm mindful that many of the students that I meet will have had previous negative experiences around judgment and around assumption of lack of capacity and so on. And for that reason, many of the students that I would meet take some time to share with me about their autism diagnosis. And I suppose as a result, without knowing, unless an educator is actively planning all of the time and trying to facilitate students of all different neurotype all of the time, it can be difficult for an educator to be able to facilitate that. Does that make sense? And as I say, that's no judgment in any way of any autistic student. It's just, I suppose that would be my experience of the adult learners, particularly, who I would support.
And I think that's where the promise of universal design comes in, despite its limitations, is in planning so that students don't have to disclose if they're not comfortable doing so.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that the day that we see all institutions, primary school, secondary school, and university level, encompassing and offering that kind of support is the day that we're after getting it right, really. Do you know?
And Patrick makes a really good point in the chat about the importance of having leaders who are neurodivergent, racialized, minoritized, in order to move into positions with power to promote systems change. In a world where these potential leaders face all sorts of barriers, as well as pressure to volunteer time to advocate for their community.
I think the point that we just heard about how it takes students time
to be open about their challenges is important. I work in a space where everyone is neurodivergent, and it still takes them an entire semester to learn how to advocate. And a lot of my work is done helping them with the language to do that, feeding back to them what I see so they can ask me to do it again, you know, let's try that practice again. Let's do it a little bit differently. So there's a lot of back and forth effort for quite a while before students can become fluent in their own advocacy.
There's another challenge as well, in that for some people, even positive change is still change. And the impact of change, well, let's say you are coming back into education, you know, you're out of the process of education, so you've got the change of that, and then you've got the change of, well, how do I do this? And then if that changes for even good reason, then the impact of that is still a negative impact of positive change. And that's another thing about, I suppose, the challenge of it organically growing.
I've been often thinking about the time issues. You know, I've said that it's not easy. It's never going to be easy. And I'm thinking, you know, universities and colleges, they all run to schedules. So things tend to happen if they're scheduled. So is it feasible to set aside a time for students to talk to their instructors about their individual needs, or to set aside a session for an intersectional discussion or something like that? I'm not an educator, so totally left field here.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of these comments are all centering on the fact that it has to be a process, and we have to respect how much time it takes people to feel comfortable, in addition to setting up spaces where people will hopefully feel comfortable and providing choices so people can learn what it is they want to advocate for. So I'm seeing all kinds of wonderful ideas in the chat. So we're finished in terms of the time we were planning to have here. If people have any reflections or questions you think would be important to consider going forward, or anything like that you'd like to share either in the chat or by speaking, we'd love to hear.
You can also write in the Google Docs too. We can say that we won't, you know, synthesize them for maybe, you know, however many days, and so that way it gives you time to reflect over the course of, I don't know, the weekend.
I love that idea, because we're at CUNY, we're heading into spring break, so we won't do anything with them until after spring break. So if you continue to share your ideas, then we'll go through the Google Docs and take the ideas and make a massive working document that we can all continue to edit. Because as we are seeing, this is very much a process.
And maybe that's a good way so that we can honor time for those of the people who, you know, time is like me, say like me, who like to end on time.
And Bella's been keeping us on track with time behind the scenes. So thank you all. We really appreciate your insights and that you took the time to come.
And we'll be sending the documents after spring break. We'll send the documents to the emails that you signed in on Eventbrite.
I'd just like to say thank you for making this open to everybody. I've learned loads tonight, and the speakers were just amazing. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. We learned so much from all of you.
I feel like we all have so much more to say.
Yeah. Well, I think what we did here was pretty amazing in that it's very experimental and sort of organizing masses of people and time delays and all sorts of things like that. So, you know, I think we should give ourselves a pat on the back.
And talking about universal design, but in a construct that isn't allowing us to try and practice universal design very freely. So We'll keep trying.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thank you all. This was really awesome. And thank you, TC, for sharing your story. It was really awesome. And I'm proud of you for doing that. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Mac.
Thank you. Looking forward to the next one.